The night was heavy, not just with missiles or sirens, but with centuries of weight, of silence, humiliation, occupation, and unanswered prayers. It wasn't just a strike, it was a shift. For decades, Israel had held the image of invincibility in the region, backed by global powers, protected by silence, and unchecked in its aggression. But then came one night when Iran responded, not with mere words, not through diplomacy or condemnation, but with calculated power that pierced not just the skies, but the illusion of superiority. The world watched, but strangely, it said nothing. And in that silence, millions heard everything. It wasn't the first time a conflict had erupted in the Middle East, but this night felt different. It wasn't just another skirmish or retaliation. It was a message written not in ink, but in fire across the sky. A message that pride, built on oppression, has an expiration date. That the cries of the oppressed do not vanish into the void. They rise, they build, and they return with a strength that surprises even the powerful. Iran, often demonized and cornered, stood tall not to provoke but to remind. Dignity matters. And in that moment, as Israeli defenses trembled and leaders scrambled, something shifted in the hearts of millions. Across the Muslim world, the reaction wasn't one of bloodlust. It was one of quiet validation. For too long, people had watched children bombed, homes destroyed, and voices silenced, all while the world excused it in the name of defense. But on this night, it wasn't just a military move. It was a soul-deep statement that the oppressed are not invisible, that even giants can be humbled. And while politicians argued and analysts spun narratives, ordinary people looked to the sky with tears, not of sadness, but of strange relief. Someone had finally answered back. What made this moment more powerful was not just the missiles, it was the world's silence afterward. Media outlets downplayed it, politicians avoided it. No grand condemnations, no emergency UN meetings, no dramatic statements from global powers, just silence. And in that silence, Muslims saw the truth they already knew, that justice is not given, it is taken, that some lives are deemed less valuable unless someone dares to change the script. Iran did not just attack a country, it pierced through decades of one-sided narratives. This wasn't a glorification of war. No true believer loves conflict. But justice has always demanded courage. And when diplomacy is ignored, when human rights are mocked, and when the oppressed are told to be patient while their children are buried, then the night speaks for them. This night did just that. And while the missiles faded, the memory won't. Because pride, once cracked, never shines the same again. And when truth rises with power, it cannot be silenced, not even by the whole world. Iran's unexpected strike on Israel that night was not just a military move. It was a psychological earthquake. For decades, Israel had moved through the Middle East with an air of untouchability, armed with advanced technology, global alliances, and layers of defense systems. It had always projected power and control. But on this night, that illusion cracked. Iran launched a direct, calculated attack, not reckless, not scattered, but focused and precise. It wasn't a show of rage. It was a message, carefully crafted and executed with confidence. And when it landed, the ripple was felt not just in Tel Aviv, but in Washington, London, Riyadh, and beyond. This wasn't just about missiles, it was about reputation. Israel had always relied on deterrence, the belief that no one would dare strike back. But now someone did, and not from the shadows, not through proxies, but openly, boldly, and unapologetically. The shock wasn't just in the impact, it was in the audacity. Iran stood up, knowing the risks, and said, "Enough." That one word, carried by steel and fire, echoed louder than 1,000 speeches. It exposed a reality the world had long ignored: that dominance built on injustice is fragile when faced with fearless resistance. And as Israeli citizens ran for shelter, something unfamiliar gripped the nation: vulnerability. For the first time in years, the question wasn't how much damage Israel would cause, it was how much it would take. The defenses, the intelligence systems, the alliances, they were all still there, but something deeper had shifted. Iran's strike punctured the psychological shield Israel had worn for decades. The aura of invincibility faded, and in its place came uncertainty. Around the world, governments issued muted responses. Allies hesitated. News outlets reported cautiously. And in that strange calm, the meaning of the night grew louder. This was not just about Iran or Israel. It was about accountability. It was about the idea that those who had been wronged could no longer be silenced. That even if the world turned its eyes away, history would not. The oppressed had spoken in a language the oppressor finally understood. It wasn't about destruction, it was about dignity. And from that night forward, the balance of fear shifted, not with chaos, but with clarity. As the world woke up to the news of Iran's strike, many were expecting loud condemnations, fiery speeches at the UN, emergency meetings, and widespread outrage. But instead, the world stayed eerily silent. The silence wasn't due to confusion or lack of information. It was deliberate, calculated. The same global leaders who rushed to defend certain nations remained quiet, unsure of how to react when the narrative didn't fit their preferred storyline. This was not a response from a rogue militia or an anonymous group. It was a sovereign nation responding directly to decades of provocation, humiliation, and aggression. And yet, no major outcry, no moral lectures, no unified outpouring of support, just the uncomfortable sound of quiet. This silence spoke louder than any press release. For millions around the world, especially Muslims, this silence was nothing new. They had watched Gaza burn while the world justified it. They had seen illegal settlements expand while media called it disputed land. They had heard the cries of Palestinian mothers drowned out by the excuses of politicians. But when Iran acted, the sudden lack of response exposed what they had always felt. Some lives are grieved, while others are in. Some acts of war are justified, while others are villainized, depending on who is holding the weapon. The world's silence became a mirror. It reflected double standards so clearly that they could no longer be denied. Why was this act of retaliation not met with the same level of condemnation that other, far more brutal assaults received? Why did the same voices that chant for peace not speak when the oppressed defended their own dignity? The silence didn't just reveal hypocrisy, it revealed fear. Fear that the narrative was changing. Fear that the oppressed were no longer willing to wait for justice from those who benefit from their suffering. In mosques and homes across the world, people didn't need news anchors to explain what had happened. They understood the weight of the moment. The silence of the world was not a pause, it was a confession. A confession that justice has always been selective, that the powerful speak when it suits them and stay quiet when truth embarrasses them. And so, the people whispered prayers of gratitude, not for violence, but for courage. For the first time in a long time, someone dared to disrupt the silence with strength. The night Iran struck back wasn't just marked by explosions, it was marked by unity. Across the Muslim world, hearts beat as one. From Jakarta to Istanbul, from Karachi to Cairo, people watched and prayed, not out of thirst for blood, but out of longing for dignity. For years, the Ummah had been scattered, divided by borders, sex, politics, and power games. But in that moment, when a long silenced voice roared back against decades of oppression, something shifted deep within the global Muslim consciousness. For the first time in a long time, it felt like someone had stood tall, not just for a country, but for a principle. The pain of Palestine was no longer ignored. The humiliation that had been swallowed in silence for years had finally found a voice that echoed in every Muslim home. This unity wasn't about nationalism, it wasn't about Shia or Sunni. It was something more spiritual, more instinctive. It was about a shared wound, a shared sorrow, and a shared hope. When Iran responded, millions didn't cheer for destruction, they wept for the long-lost sense of honor. They saw in this action a reflection of what they had wished for in countless protests, du'as and Friday sermons, the courage to say enough. It didn't matter what school of thought the missile came from. What mattered was that someone finally reminded the world that Muslims are not invisible, that their pain is not cheap, and that their blood is not worthless. Social media lit up, not with hatred, but with solidarity. People weren't calling for chaos, they were reclaiming identity. For years, Muslim lands had been invaded, occupied, insulted, and dismissed. Leaders had bowed to pressure, and people had grown tired of waiting for justice that never came. But this night, it was different. It reminded the Ummah that it still had breath, it still had courage, and it still had the ability to stand. And perhaps that was the most powerful part of it all. Not the strike itself, but the awakening it stirred. The feeling that we are not alone, not weak, not irrelevant. The message was clear. When one rises with truth, the heart of the Ummah rises with it. Even in silence, even in pain, we are still one. While the world focused on the missiles and headlines, what truly changed that night was something far more profound: the narrative. For decades, the dominant voice in global politics and media painted a picture of power, innocence, and victimhood in favor of Israel, while those who resisted occupation were branded as threats, radicals, or extremists. But Iran's bold and unapologetic strike disrupted that long-standing script. It wasn't a faceless group or underground cell. It was a state with the full weight of its sovereignty standing up against a military giant. And for once, the roles were reversed. The oppressor appeared vulnerable, and the oppressed, though demonized for decades, seemed to speak with a clarity the world could no longer dismiss. This moment was about more than geopolitics, it was about truth. For years, the Palestinian struggle had been reduced to sound bites. Every act of resistance was labeled as terrorism, and every Israeli response, no matter how brutal, was called self-defense. But Iran's action forced the world to look again, to re-examine what they had blindly accepted for so long. The carefully built illusion of moral superiority began to fade, replaced by uncomfortable questions. Why does one side's pain command global tears while the other's is silenced? Why are calls for freedom labeled dangerous while oppression is called peacekeeping? The shift wasn't loud, but it was powerful. Journalists hesitated, politicians stumbled over their statements. Influencers and thinkers across the globe began to speak more openly, more boldly. The usual script had cracks, and truth began to leak through. This was no longer just about two nations. It was about centuries of imbalance, of one voice being amplified while another was erased. That night gave rise to a different kind of courage, not the courage to fight with weapons, but the courage to speak, question, and rethink. And as more people around the world opened their eyes, the media could no longer control the narrative as tightly as before. People started digging deeper, reading history, listening to voices they had once ignored. It was the beginning of a new awareness, a subtle but seismic change. Because once a mind wakes up to truth, it's hard to put it back to sleep. And that night, Iran didn't just shake a nation, it shook the story the world had been told for too long. While politicians debated and analysts scrambled for explanations, one powerful reality unfolded on the streets. Millions of Muslims, many of them youth, felt something awaken inside them. It wasn't rage, it wasn't violence, it was clarity. Clarity that their identity, their history, and their pain had been ignored for far too long. For years, many had felt disconnected, pulled between cultures, lost between headlines that didn't represent them, and burdened by a constant need to explain their faith, their values, their very existence. But that night, when Iran struck back with unwavering resolve, it reminded them of something vital. Strength and faith are not opposites. Honor and patience can walk hand in hand. And courage in the face of injustice is not extremism, it is dignity. In mosques, coffee shops, college campuses, and family gatherings, the conversation changed. Suddenly, people were asking not just what happened, but why it had taken this long. Why had no one stood up before? Why did Muslims always have to beg for justice instead of demand it? And why did defending their people always come with the risk of being labeled or punished? The silence from global powers only deepened this awakening. It confirmed what many already knew, but rarely said aloud. Our lives are not valued equally on the world stage. But this realization didn't lead to despair. It led to resolve. Young Muslims especially began to feel more connected to their faith, not because of political slogans, but because they saw in that moment a living example of what it meant to stand for truth, regardless of consequence. It brought the stories of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the early believers to life, not as distant tales from history, but as real blueprints for resilience and justice. Suddenly, prayers had more meaning. The Quran's verses about oppression and struggle felt closer to home, and the Ummah, often divided by language, culture, or sect, felt more united in soul. This wasn't just Iran's moment. It became a moment for every Muslim who had ever felt silence, every youth who had ever felt like their faith made them misunderstood, every heart that had quietly wept for Gaza, for Syria, for Kashmir. That night lit a spark, a fire of awareness, unity, and purpose that couldn't be put out. In the quiet that followed the strike, something louder than bombs echoed through the Muslim world, a realization that silence can no longer be an option. For too long, the Ummah had been told to stay calm, to be diplomatic, to wait. But nothing changed. Palestine continued to bleed, voices continued to be censored, and the dignity of Muslims around the globe was quietly buried under politics and propaganda. What Iran did that night, regardless of politics or alliances, reignited a question in every Muslim heart. If not now, then when? If we do not stand for our brothers and sisters, who will? This wasn't just about military might. It was about spiritual awakening. The Quran reminds us again and again that standing for truth is not optional, it's a duty. That oppression must be resisted, not tolerated, and that unity is strength. For decades, division weakened the Ummah. Nations more loyal to superpowers than to their own people, youth more engaged with trends than truth, leaders more focused on power than principles. But that night exposed the cost of silence. And in that exposure, a shift happened. Families who had never spoken about Palestine before suddenly sat together discussing its history. Teens who had only followed sports and entertainment began sharing videos and articles about injustice. People started praying again, not just out of habit, but out of heartfelt connection to something bigger than themselves. It wasn't about Iran alone. It was about what the act represented: a refusal to accept humiliation, a reminder that even if the world stays silent, we don't have to. And perhaps most beautifully, it reignited compassion. People gave more in charity. They smiled more at each other. They hugged tighter. Because when you realize how fragile dignity is in this world, you begin to treasure your identity, your brotherhood, and your faith more deeply. It wasn't just a political night, it was a spiritual one. The night Iran struck, the Ummah remembered who it was. Not weak, not forgotten, not lost, but chosen by Allah to carry a message of justice, mercy, and truth. And when a people remember their purpose, no amount of silence in the world can drown out their voice. That voice had begun to rise again, and this time, it would not be silenced. The night Iran struck was more than a political move. It was a mirror held up to the world, reflecting decades of silence, imbalance, and selective morality. It shattered the illusion that some lives matter more than others, and reminded us that courage still exists in a world trained to bow to pressure. But most importantly, it reignited something within the hearts of millions. A sense of unity, dignity, and spiritual responsibility. The silence of the world was deafening, but the voice of truth grew louder in response. This wasn't about supporting a government. It was about awakening a people. It was about remembering that standing for justice is not just an option in Islam, it is an obligation. And that night, many remembered. Thank you for watching this video and being part of a growing wave of awareness. If this message resonated with you, share it. Start conversations. Reconnect with your faith. And above all, never underestimate the power of standing for truth, no matter how loud the silence around you may be. May Allah keep our hearts firm, our eyes open, and our voices clear in the face of injustice.